Our speaker today is Roger Duffield. Roger has been the president of Intivate since 2012 and has over 30 years of experience in claims, insurance, and risk management. Previous to Roger's time at Intivate, he worked with Christian Brothers Services, with a focus on child sexual abuse prevention. He has extensive experience serving large clients and helping them to successfully and effectively address child sexual abuse at an organizational level. So let's jump in today. Roger will be covering a basic awareness of child sexual abuse, legal and procedural processes, explore some practical applications, help us rethink the conversation, and offer some resources. We'll finish with our Q&A. I'll give a short instruction on how to obtain that free sample of our toolkit, and that'll wrap up our webinar. And with that, Roger, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Chelsea. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to present this webinar. I think it's an important topic. Today, it seems like we are guided by headlines and 24-hour media, and this topic gets lost, and it's one that's very uncomfortable to talk about. And when we discuss the presentation for today, I would like to really focus on changing the conversation. The reason that I'd like to change the conversation is that I believe with the information that we know today, we can make a real significant difference in children's, minors' lives and protect them from people that are really looking to harm them. And we can do that within today's environment, within our organizations, without a significant change to how we're functioning within the workplace. So the first part of the presentation, what I'd like to do is just review where we are today, some information that you may or may not be aware of. We're going to talk a little bit about policies and procedures, and then I really want to get into how do we change this conversation. So as we do that, I'd like to first take a look at where are we today. And it's a little frightening. Where we are is, here's a story from USA Today, headline, that 100 teachers lost their license, yet they're still working with children or young adults. That is something that we have to be vigilant and not to allow happen. Another one, and I'm sure many of you have seen this one, the U.S. women's gymnastic coach, Larry Nassar, has been jailed up to 175 years. But if you look at this, for abusing more than 150 women or girls, and those are the known ones, we can only imagine what that's like. But I saw this headline recently, and I thought this is one of the challenges within the school environment that we are struck with. Districts estimate that they may spend $100,000 to successfully terminate a teacher who fights dismissal, and up to $300,000 if they lose. The reason for that is if they lose, they may be responsible for paying the teacher's legal fees. So this is a real scary environment with a lot of dynamics, but it's something that we can't estimate. So those were the headlines, but let's look at some information that's a little more real life. 1 in 4 girls are estimated to be sexually abused before they reach the age of 18. And when we say that, what that means is that there is some physical sexual encounter with girls, 1 in 6 boys. Here's another scary one. This is not the, this isn't the scary person at night that we don't know. 90% of the victims of child sexual abuse are known to the perpetrator. It is a frightening statistic. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that we can begin to zero in on this. 76% of the perpetrators are adults. So the other frightening thing is that leaves 25% that are child-on-child victims or perpetrators. And more recently, I've been involved with a group that's really focused on insurance with schools in the state of California, that there's a crisis on hand, and it's related to that very first that very first slide that we had that said, here's 100 teachers that are teaching. I'm not saying that those were in California. What I'm saying is that it's real and it's impacting our schools and ultimately the citizens who are paying for schools. So this is a topic that's not going away, and I think there's some opportunities for us to make some changes. So let's look at a couple of myths that you may think are real or not real. The first one we've already talked about. It's not just girls that are victims, that boys are victims as well, and not quite at the same rate, but a pretty alarming rate. We said 1 in 6 just a second ago. A myth is that only men are perpetrators. Currently, that is the majority of the perpetrators, but it is not exclusive to men. What's interesting with that is I was having a conversation recently with a gentleman who's very familiar with this topic. He's a risk manager. Part of his group that he deals with was actually with schools, so he's familiar with this topic. He's seen claims on this topic. But one of the things that surprised me, he was talking about a conversation that he was having with a coworker and how important it is that she keep her daughter away from being alone with men, male teachers, at school. And I couldn't help but think, you know, you're in this world. There's still that myth that's out there. It's really anybody can be a perpetrator. One of the myths that we've heard is children with disabilities are not at risk of abuse. The truth is that it can be up. Studies have shown that it's up to 3 times more likely that a child with disabilities will be abused. Here's the one that I think is really frightening, and frankly, if there was any part of these myths that I would like to get changed, it would be this one. Children can't be believed. The reality is children are not usually going to lie about sexual abuse. There's thoughts that there are times that children come forward and recant, and so they must have been lying. Again, studies have shown that often what's taken place is that child has gotten scared for whatever reason it may be. Maybe people didn't respond in a way that he felt that he was protected or she was protected. Children can be believed, and I think this is an important myth. But here's the one that I think we really need to break. Child abusers are easily spotted. Creepy single male shady stranger that always has candy in his pocket and lurks around parks and zoos. And we had an individual in our office that wrote this, and it made me at first smile, but here's the reality. These people still do exist, and I wanted to share an example with you. One of my friends, who again is familiar with this topic and information, one of his children, they were on a AU sporting event, and it was for hockey. They had all of their kids go after the hockey game to the hotel that they were staying at out of town, and they watched a gentleman come in or leave his car, come in. He had his goggles, his fins, and his snorkel on, and started swimming in the pool. And because this gentleman was aware of different types of red flags, immediately saw something wrong with this, as he was lurking around all of the children. And so they got the manager of the hotel, and come to find out this person was not even resident, or not a resident, but was not staying at the hotel. That kind of stuff is frightening. And so when there's water and changing and swimming, it's not unusual to see this last type person in that area. So just something that we wanted to talk about. Child sexual abuse awareness. A lot of times when we're doing abuse awareness training, we talk about different types of abuse. We talk about sexual abuse, we talk about emotional abuse, we talk about physical abuse. Today's discussion is really centered around child sexual abuse. And recently I was having a conversation with another risk manager who, again, deals with schools. And he was talking to people on a committee that has to have this conversation. And he said he was really taken back by how uncomfortable this topic is. This is a topic we don't like to talk about. If it's not in front of us, we'd rather ignore it. But I think it's important when we talk about sexual abuse, that's exactly what it is. It is an adult or another peer or youth that is sexually abusing a child. But I wanted to make this nuance. Suspected sexual abuse. The reality is we're probably not going to see anybody sexually abusing a child. And so it becomes a little trickier with that notion or that thought in mind. And so, again, we're talking about sexual abuse. Are we really going to see that? Probably not. We hear stories or what have you. But if you think to that very first statistic, 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused as minors, those people are all around us. And so it's something that we really need to take note of, and yet you've probably never seen anybody being sexually abused. So we need to bridge this gap, and so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about mandated reporter, and probably most of you are familiar. You probably even sat through a mandated reporter training. And so really there's, in each state, there are groups of people. In some states, every single person is considered a mandated reporter. And we're going to talk about the legalities of that a little bit. But as we move through this, what I think is important is we're not talking about the person that snatches and grabs a child. That is a very rare situation, the stranger danger. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that 90% of the people that we know that victims of child abuse, the 90% that are abusing them that they know. There's going to be patterns of behavior, and that's called grooming. Again, it may be something that you're familiar with, but the good and scary thing, and it's really both, there's patterns of behavior that we can pick up on, and those are called red flags. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So there's sexual abuse, yes, some physical interaction that's sexually abusing a child or a minor. We suspect sexual abuse, mandated reporter, grooming, the fact that these people have patterns of behavior that we can pick up on. So as we move through this, we're going to get into a little more detail. Oops, I went the wrong way. So we're going to talk about physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, and behavioral boundaries. And I think what's important with these are really, we're going to call them red flags or indicators, and we're separating these like they're nice and neat and orderly. The truth is they're going to blend together, but I'm going to talk about them individually. So for example, a physical boundary violations really involves the desensitizing of a child with touch. What's going to happen is that person that's wanting to get close to a child, wanting to sexually abuse a child, is going to start small. They're going to be putting a hand around their shoulders, on their arms, and they're going to keep desensitizing that child, that minor. So as things become more sexual, it's a gradual situation, and it becomes not so far out of ordinary. The nice thing about that is we can pick up on those things. Emotional boundaries, I think this is one that really begins to get at the heart of it. So typically a predator will pick out children that are a little more, or minors that are a little more vulnerable. Maybe they're having problems at home. Maybe they're in a single parent home. Maybe they're having problems in school, and they're going to pick up on that. And they're very skilled at finding the emotional needs of children, and they start talking to them as if they're a peer. And as time progresses, they'll start having that child begin keeping secrets from adults or parents or what have you. And they're going to start small and innocent. And maybe it's, hey, I'm going to get some, let's go get some ice cream. Let's not tell anybody. It's our secret. It's making them feel special. But what they're doing is they're really grooming that child, even the community, that's how their behavior is. And so often these individuals are very respected in the community. They're known by people. And part of their facade is really making sure that people would never think that they would do anything wrong. And our job is people protecting youth and minors. We want to make sure that what we're doing is we're familiar with these red flags, these indicators, and we bring them up. Not as you're sexually abusing a child, but you have these behaviors that are out of bounds. When we get to behavioral boundaries, really what this is doing is maybe we have roles in our school, in our Y, at our camp, but you have a supervisor, somebody in charge that's just going to go around them. Examples maybe gift giving, treating one camper different than another one. It may be communicating after the camp is over with. What we want to do is set up more specific things that are appropriate or are inappropriate for those who are working with children and youth. But here's where, as we begin to understand these red flags, this is where our innate instincts really become important. And we may call those a gut feeling, or something just made me feel creepy. And I think this is an important element that we need to consider. And where our gut feeling comes from is really throughout our existence. We've been wired in a way that we understand danger. We understand things in our environment have changed. And over time, we kind of get desensitized to that. We talked about that earlier with the physical boundaries. We become a little bit desensitized. What I mean here, and I really want to implore, is that we don't just ignore these feelings. We give it some credibility. And what I mean by that is, okay, something seemed weird with Dr. Williams, and what seemed weird is, I can't really get my handle on it. Well, you know what? Ask yourself why. Really, what was it that Dr. Williams was doing? Was he being alone with a child? Was he acting differently? What we've learned is to dismiss those instincts, those gut feelings that we have, and what we really want you to do is take note of those. We want you to ask yourself why and try to be specific. And I'm going to say the first time I heard this, I was really taken back by that, because I'm somebody that watches patterns of behavior. I don't know where it has come from. I know that we all do that. But for me, it was always real simple. I would see somebody and I could tell their emotional state was different. And as a young person, I always thought it was related to me. The reality is, something changed. I don't know what it was. Maybe they had a sick family member or what have you. But I could pick up on those things real easily. And over time, and after I started hearing this, I started asking myself, why do I feel that way? And the more that we're conscious of that, the more that we can get a handle on why do I feel that way. Well, it's because I saw Dr. Williams after school multiple days in a row with the same student, and they seem surprisingly close. Okay, does that mean that Dr. Williams is sexually abusing a child? Absolutely not. But does it mean that there may be some boundary violations that we need to deal with? Yes, that is something that we need to talk about. As we get through our red flags, we know behavior that's appropriate and inappropriate. We start to trust our gut feelings. Here's something that's frightening to me, is why people don't report. We're overwhelmed with the idea that a child could be sexually abused. And what's frightening is to think that that is a possibility, that I'm just going to ignore it because it's too overwhelming to me, but the reality is that happens. We also have stereotypes may play a role of who is the person that we're seeing interacting with that child. It couldn't be Dr. Williams. He's the principal of the school. He's well respected by everybody. That's part of that person's grooming process if they are truly an abuser. It also could be somebody with just bad boundaries. So our job is really to begin to not try to identify sexual abuse, seeing somebody being sexually abused, but really begin to let go of some of those stereotypes and trust our instincts, trust our knowledge. Some reasons people don't report is they may be emotionally dependent or financially dependent or physically dependent on a family member that's doing the abuse, and they don't know what will happen if that person is no longer part of their situation within their circle of influence. What would that mean? Self-doubts and fears. This is where we begin to second guess ourselves, or we don't want to report something because we don't want the outcome of somebody being accused of sexual abuse. I want to go back to this red flags though for a second and tell you just how powerful having this knowledge is. A number of years ago, I was working with a coworker, and within that environment, we had a video that showed two individuals who had actually sexually abused children. They talked about how they gained access to those people, and they put it on video as part of their sentencing. They were to, and part of their probation, they had the opportunity to get, I don't know, reduction or what have you from having these interviews. And I shared that with a new coworker, and the thing that struck me, she's like, you know, there is a person in our community that my niece and nephew who live by, there's kids around this person's house all of the time. He's got video games inside, and the kids are there. They're like literally all inside the house, outside the house all the time. And she immediately went home. She told her brother and sister-in-law about that, and she called the police. The outcome was that person was no longer there 30 days later. They never heard what happened. She didn't know if the person moved out, but that person is no longer abusing children in that area. What we can only hope for is that the police interacted and intervened and took action with that person. Regardless, that's how, as we begin to understand what red flags are, trusting our instincts, our gut, and not having fear of reporting. I think that is just a critical, really critical in these instances. What I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss is the idea of known sexual abuse, and we've been hinting at this in policy violations, red flag violations. If we have codes of conduct, we know what red flags are, we begin to change the conversation, not so much as do we know somebody's committing child sexual abuse, but it's a performance behavior. This person is interacting in a way that violates our policy. We can all get around on, hey, look, I never said Dr. Williams is sexually abusing anybody, but we have a policy that we are not supposed to be alone in a room after hours with students and the door closed. Whatever those rules may be, those boundaries are, Dr. Williams is doing that. That's a performance issue. As I said, we don't know that Dr. Williams is sexually abusing a child. In fact, we hope that he's not. We hope that is just a minor oversight of violation. But we do know that people that are committing sexual abuse, they're going to push boundaries. So we want to make it clear to perpetrators, you're not going to do that in our organization. If we can get all organizations with that same mindset, those individuals are going to have a hard time finding access to children. So let's talk about policies and procedures, and how does this changing the conversation work from a practical standpoint? Well, we probably all have, if you're working with youth, you have a mandated reporter policy. And really what that means, if you suspect child abuse, you need to report that directly to CPS, Child Protective Services, the police, whatever it is in your state. It doesn't mean that it's okay to report that to your supervisor and you've done your job. No, you report directly to the agency or agencies that handle those things. As an administrator, if that information comes to you, you tell that person to report, and you yourself report that information. You should not be doing an investigation. That is left for the experts, for the police to do. So that's mandated reporter. But I think things get a little more, really can start with the screening of either volunteers or employees, is begin to ask behavioral-based questions. Things like, you know, how long have you worked with 10 to 12-year-old boys? Why do you like that? What do you do in your spare time to kind of wind down if you have a full-time job with 10 to 12-year-old boys? What is it that you do? If you see a pattern of everything they do is with 10 to 12-year-old boys, that's a red flag. Past behavior is usually indicative of future behavior. So ask those questions around interaction that they've had with whatever group that they're working with. This one I love, reference checking. And I feel like this is one of those huge issues for me, I just think is misunderstood. You've probably sat in a training session with an attorney who says, you know, name, rank, and serial number. Don't give anything else out. The truth is, when you're interviewing, what you need to do is ask about, you need to have references that will talk to you. It may not be their past supervisor, but maybe it's 2 supervisors ago, a coworker. So we want to be able to check references, and if you ask specific questions like, do you have any concerns with this individual working with 10 to 12-year-old boys? People, if you ask a direct question, they'll give you a direct answer. I've used that every day when it relates to hiring people, and it's amazing the information that you receive. So don't overlook reference checks, just discounting them, that nobody will tell me anything. They would never provide a reference that will give derogatory information. People are typically honest, and they're not going to be in collusion about abusing children. So if you have a question, ask it, you'll get an answer. We should have a code of conduct when somebody is hired that they should sign, and red flags. So we've talked about red flags enough. A couple of items that I want to discuss here. We've touched on these quite a bit. Mandated reporting. If you are a mandated reporter and you fail to report, you may become legally liable, and the organization may not protect you. And the part that I want to share is, typically when we're talking about changing the language, reporting red flags and addressing red flags are really, for me, a performance and behavior issue. They are not a sexual abuse issue. However, if during the investigation you suspect child sexual abuse, you need to immediately stop and contact the authorities, the people that we spoke about before. And again, since those are 2 different things, we want to separate those. It's okay to investigate red flags. That is performance. Somebody has acted out of your policy. Those are things that we are expected to do as managers and supervisors. So bringing it all together, let's check, let's create and have some basic policies. Let's have a code of conduct. Let's have our mandated reporter. Let's have our red flags. Let's educate our staff, volunteers, participants, parents. And we now know we no longer need to identify abuse. What we should be and can do is identify red flags that we've trained people on. So I think it's important as we evolve in this world, that it is not just sexual abuse that we're looking for, but it's really understanding those red flags and communicating our concerns, those gut feelings, those instincts. And what I feel strongly about is I do believe that we can make a difference. So that's what I had to share, and I'm excited to answer any questions that there may be.
Thank you, Roger, for sharing your insight. From here, we will move into our Q&A. Just a quick reminder, it's not too late to submit a question. You can still submit a question using that chat feature at the bottom right of your screen and sending that to the Intivate host. I have a few questions that I prepared ahead of time that I haven't shared with Roger ahead of time, so we'll get a really good first impression answer. So I'll move right into those. Roger, my first question is this. You mentioned the cost school districts may face to successfully terminate a teacher, and it can be a pretty hefty price. What kind of advice would you offer to organizations that need to take action, but the cost of taking action might result in a fatal financial blow to the organization?
You know, that's a really good question. First, for organizations like schools, and somebody who's a fan of the insurance industry and risk management, what I would share, the more that we can put behavior into this is performance and not a witch hunt, what it would be looked at as a witch hunt for sexual abuse, the better off we are, and probably the lower those costs go down. And let me give you a real life example of that. We had I was working with the school board, and they had a gentleman that was on administrative leave because he had, there were a couple of allegations. They were older allegations of inappropriate interaction with two of his students, female students. And he was well respected in the community. In fact, he was put on administrative leave. And what took place was there was a discussion about that at the school board, and all kinds of people came out to support him. And here was one of the things that one of the comments that the board member shared, one of the board members shared with me, is while we were in that community open session, one of the parents stood up and said, "My daughter was left was with that teacher at the school by herself at 3 a.m. and nothing was going on." That should have been immediate dismissal, but because there was no policy, they couldn't do that. The outcome was that teacher stayed on administrative leave for more than a year, and it cost the school several $100,000. What's critical, though, is the school never relented on their position. And I think it's more important to make sure that we do the right thing. And while there may be costs, there's also usually insurance that's there to help protect the schools. Now, will that potentially have an impact on future premiums? Yes, it will, but there may not be a full on cost directly to that school. So I would encourage the school to look at their insurance policies and really understand where their coverage is and how that relates. But at the end of the day, I think it's important, if we have better policies, we may be able to get there on performance as opposed to sexual abuse.
Thanks for that insight, Roger. My last question is this. As an organization, failure of staff to report is a big liability. How might a person running operations, say a director, for example, maximize their staff's likelihood to report when they witness either a simple boundary violation or a more serious red flag?
You know, I think that's a really good question, Chelsea, and my response is making this topic really around red flags and boundaries much more comfortable. If we talk about that in staff meetings and we have an example or two, and we do that once or twice a year, I know that it is much easier for people to get comfortable with that. And as we have those conversations, what we begin to talk about is protecting one another from false allegations, because nobody wants a false allegation. And if we can begin to change that dynamic just by talking about it, it's helpful. But again, what we know is this is this is an uncomfortable topic, but I really think it's bringing it up repeatedly in staff meetings, making this part of our culture. Is we're here to protect kids and one another, and we can do both by using good judgment and sharing information.
Yeah, thanks for that insight, Roger. That's all we have today for Q&A. I'll wrap up quickly here. I'll be following up with an email that will provide a link to a short survey about our webinar. Please fill that out, as we do love feedback. This survey asks you to confirm if you'd like for us to email you a PDF sample of our toolkit, so be sure to check that option when you submit the survey. That toolkit includes a code of conduct, red flags awareness flyer, and that's for staff, and also a separate one geared towards guardians, and a list of our references used in this webinar if you'd like to do some more research. That full toolkit includes a centralized location to house these resources on the Intivate LMS, and includes a comprehensive training module for staff and volunteers. And that concludes the Intivate Smarter Adults, Safer Children webinar. We thank you for joining us and hope you have a great Thursday.